Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct the events here at the Strand. We are so happy to have everyone here, particularly considering the state of the world. Before we launch into discussion of Jennifer Steil's new book, Exile Music, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 43 stores over the course of 93 years to just the one store, The Strand, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we are excited to have with us Jennifer Steil to launch her newest book, Exile Music. Jennifer is the author of two previous books, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, a memoir of her experience as a journalist in Yemen, and The Ambassador's Wife, a novel about a hostage crisis that was also inspired by Steil's own experience. She currently lives in Uzbekistan with her husband and daughter. Joining Jennifer in conversation is fellow author Celia Laskey. Celia's debut novel, Under the Rainbow, is out now with Riverhead Books. Her other work has appeared in Guernica, the Minnesota Review, Day One, and elsewhere. She is an MFA from the University of New Mexico and currently lives in Los Angeles with her wife and their dog, Whiskey. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jennifer and Celia.
Hi there.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. So, shall I start by saying a little bit about the book and reading
Yeah,
it?
I think give people a little summary, and then I think we're going to have Jennifer do about like a 2-page reading from the book, just so you guys can get a little taste.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm Jennifer, and my new book is called Exile Music. And the novel is based on an overlooked, underexplored part of World War II history. Basically, the book follows a family of Viennese Jewish musicians who flee Austria in 1939 to escape the Nazis. And they end up in Bolivia because that's the only place they can get a visa for. And the book the beginning takes place in Austria, but most of the book takes place in Bolivia because that's where my family rebuilds their lives. And my main character is a girl named Orly. She's around 10 when the book starts. And you kind of go through up into her mid 40s, I guess, by the time the book ends. So okay. That might be enough for now. So it's basically about this Austrian Jewish family rebuilding their lives in La Paz, Bolivia, where I happen to have lived for 4 years. So it's a place I know pretty well. And the very brief, it's less than 2 pages, section that I thought I'd read you before we launch into a conversation about the book, and then a Q&A, this section takes place after Orly and her family, her father and mother, have arrived in La Paz. And this is the first time. Okay, so one thing I should tell you is her father was a viola player with the Vienna Philharmonic, and her mother was an opera singer. And her brother escaped separately, so he's not with them in La Paz. So it's just Orly with her mother and father, and she's about 11 when this scene takes place. So this is the first time that she hears her father play music since they've left Austria. Okay. Over the first few weeks of our new life in La Paz, we pieced together a home from 3 straw mattresses, donated dishes, borrowed books, and a table and chairs crafted from packing crates. As soon as these set pieces were in place, my father sat down on a crate after dinner one night and took out his viola for the first time. He hadn't opened the case since we arrived, although he'd often played with other musicians on the ship. Now he ran his fingers over the instrument like he was relearning its surfaces. He tightened his bow and drew it across the D string. We both winced. But half an hour later, as I lay on the floor reading at his feet, a stroke of his arm drew forth the flight of notes that began Fantasia Chromatica. My heart leapt after those notes, following them like butterflies up a path it knew well. It didn't matter that his fingers were stiff and weak, that they faltered at that speed. Listening to him play reminded me of times when I didn't know I was thirsty until I started drinking, and then the whole glass went down. Home had been with us all along. It lived in the air shimmering around my father's strings. Well, there it is. He lifted his eyes from the viola and smiled a real smile, the first I could remember seeing since the Philharmonic expelled him. So, what shall I play for you? I closed the book of fairy tales on my lap that I had borrowed from the Grubers. Schumann's Märchenbilder, the fairy tale songs. Nothing simpler? I don't want to start panting and faint in the middle of it. You just did Fantasia Chromatica. I sighed. All right. A waltz then. Strauss? I glanced over at my mother lying on a mattress, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She did not stir. My father pulled the viola from his chin and rested it on his knee. No waltzes, he said. I think I'm finished with waltzes. Well, don't ask me then, I said irritably, turning back to my book. Play whatever you like. I couldn't see the harm in playing a waltz. Hadn't we already given up enough of Austria? We had to give up Strauss now, too? A mild amusement tugged at my father's mouth. Which Märchenbilder piece, then? I suppose you want Lebhaft. Lebhaft, lively or spirited, was my favorite of the four. But I thought about how fast my father's fingers would have to move on the strings and how he'd struggled with the Fantasia. No, I'm in the mood for langsam mit melancholischem Ausdruck tonight. I just have to apologize for my German. I'm not a German speaker, so apologies to German speakers out there. This piece, slowly with melancholy expression, was one he'd played me in the evenings before bed, its gentle rhythms drawing me irresistibly into dreams. It seemed to describe the undercurrent of our life in La Paz, the way my mother drifted up and down its streets, slowly, with melancholy expression. A wise choice, kleiner Hase. Tucking the viola back under his chin, my father lifted his bow and played me langsam mit melancholischem Ausdruck. Within the first 6 notes, I was in Vienna. I was in my own bed, soft sheets drawn to my chin, Lebkuchen tucked in my arms. I'd forgotten how swiftly music could transport me. His fingers were still clumsy on the strings, even I could see it, and his rhythm staggered, but he played it all the way through. Then he started again. Scooting across the floor to lean against one of the crates, I closed my eyes. As the vibrations of his strings stirred the air around me, the small muscles along my spine spasmed and then unclenched. My stomach relaxed into roundness. My hands fell to my lap. Fear that had secreted itself in my body crept away. I let the sounds move over me like warm hands. When I heard my father play, I began to believe in our life here. So that's a little snapshot of the book.
That was a great section to read because it sort of bridges the distance between Vienna and La Paz for the first time.
Exactly, and it is music that the characters, or at least a couple of them, use as a way to build a bridge between their past and their present.
Yeah. So I figured I'd start out by asking you the question that probably everyone asks. And before that, I just want to say I loved this book so much. I probably read it in 3 days, just voraciously. And it was such a good distraction from everything going on right now. I really felt like I was out of my own mind and out of my own body. I was just completely transported to these places. It was so deeply imagined and so immersive. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just finished reading Celia's book, which is also amazing, 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 Under the Rainbow. So I hope
Thank you.
check that one out too.
So yeah, I just wanted to ask, because this book felt like so richly imagined and so personal, what was the inspiration behind it?
Well, so we moved to Bolivia in 2012 because my husband was working for the European Union at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So we moved there for his work and we lived there for 4 years. But very early on in our time in Bolivia, Tim came home from work one night and said, "Oh, I've just been talking to the Austrian consul. And did you know that there were between 10 and 20,000 Jewish refugees living in Bolivia during World War II? Many of whom were artists and musicians and creative people." And I actually hadn't known that. I'd read a lot about Jewish refugees in other parts of South America and certainly other parts of the world, but I hadn't
Mm-hmm.
heard anything about the Jewish community in Bolivia during the war. And it wasn't long after that initial conversation with my husband that I ended up meeting the son of a woman who'd escaped a town in Poland just after the war to come to Bolivia. And he became a close friend and introduced me to other refugees. And so his name's John Galanter. And what his stories were fascinating and horrifying. And the more I heard about this community and what they went through, the more I wanted to learn about them, and the more I wanted to share these stories with the rest of the world. So that's how I came to the idea of this book.
Mm.
And yes, so
Nice. And you mentioned in the introduction that, or maybe you didn't, but a big part of the first part of the book is this very deep friendship between the main character Orly and her best friend Anneliese. Am I
yeah,
saying that
I
right?
think so.
Yeah. And there were these few pages where you're describing this myth that I think Orly's mother has told her about. Um,
Yeah, probably.
yeah, and it's about these two women who fall in love and how the gods change one of them into a man so that they can be married. And when Orly hears about this myth, she sort of rejects this and says, you know, if the gods are so powerful, why can't they simply let the two women be happy together as women? And I was just so fascinated by that section because I feel like if I had been Orly's age, especially in that time period, and you know, I had heard about this myth, I probably would have been like, oh, okay, so you know, so love between two women is impossible even in myths. Okay, I get it. But Orly, you know, it like has the confidence to say, no, I don't think so, and she like asserts that it could be another way. So I was just curious, like how you thought about shaping Orly's personality and her thoughts at this age, and you know how she becomes such a strong person already.
Um, well, I mean, her personality, my writing process is organic. And by organic, I mean really inefficient and untidy. And so I kind of write my way into things rather than planning things in
Mm,
advance or saying, I want to make this character this specific way. So
mm,
with Orly, I think that came from, I'd started to research what kinds of things she would have been reading and what kinds of things she would have been exposed to. And because her mother is an opera singer and there are operas that come from Greek myths, I figured she'd be
mm,
pretty familiar with Greek myths. And so I was rereading my old copy of Ovid and rereading the story of Iphis and Ianthe. And I think what I imagined Orly, I think I was just imagining her thinking logically that if this girl falls in love with this, I mean, one of the girls, Iphis, is disguised as a boy because when she's born, her father says, if she's not a boy, I'm going to kill her. So her mother is like, well, I don't want you to kill my daughter. So she dresses her like a boy. Now, why the father never cottons onto this is another question I have about this myth. But anyway, so she's raised as a boy and she falls in love with this. She becomes close to a girl and they fall in love and want to get married. And then on their wedding day, there's a description of how the god Isis comes and makes Iphis into a man. And I thought, gosh, that must have been a real shock for Ianthe when she gets to the altar and she's like, you didn't have like all this stubble like the last time I saw you. And, you know, I just thought, wouldn't she guess that something was different? And wouldn't she think, hey, you're not who I fell in love with. You can't fool me. You're different. And so I think it just came from that, like just Orly's reading that story and saying, well, this just doesn't make sense, because she would notice that something was different. Like this person suddenly can grow a beard and has a deeper voice and bigger feet or something, you know?
Right.
So I think, you know, I was just imagining, I think also when I started working on this book, my daughter was 4, and a lot of what inspired Orly were the things my daughter would say. That I could then use, or the way she looked at the world, or things. She'd ask questions like, well, why can't these 2 bunnies get married, or whatever.
Right. I think I remember,
yeah, go on.
Sorry, I think I remember reading in another interview I found with you that the inspiration for the fictional land, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but the fictional land that Orly and Anneliese create was from your daughter.
That's true. So when Orly, my main character, is small, she and her best friend Anneliese create this imaginary land together, and it's quite elaborate. And my daughter, for years and years and years, created this elaborate land called Bunny Belts in her land. But I mean, it had a geography. We had maps of it. We knew the laws. We knew that it was run by a hermaphrodite president and a queen. Anyway, there's reasons behind all this. But so this whole land, I thought it was so interesting to watch her build this land. And then I thought, if I were living in Austria in the 1930s and the world was closing in on me like a noose, and I felt that the menace was growing every day, I would really need an imaginary world to retreat into. So I wanted that the time in Austria to be seen only from a child's point of view, what a child would have noticed and felt about that time. And so I think, for a long time, she doesn't want to think about anything other than her friend and life carrying on until, she's no longer able to pretend that anything is normal anymore.
Right. Yeah. And that was another thing that was so effective about those early chapters was, like the childlike sense of pretend and wonder that we're seeing through Orly, then contrasted with like the news bulletins at the beginning of all of those chapters. And it was just so stark, the contrast between what was happening in the world and sort of what's happening in Orly's mind. And I loved just seeing those 2 things together. Is that a structural element that you had always been using, or did it come kind of late in the process?
It came pretty late in the process. That was not part of the original manuscript or even the first 65 drafts, because this went through a lot of rewriting. That's just kind of how I work. But we were looking for ways, because I had to include the bit in Austria because I wanted there to be a contrast between their life before and their life afterwards, so that you could see who they were in their native land before you saw them as refugees. But at the same time, a lot has been written about Austria during the war. A lot has been written about that time in Vienna. And so I wanted to get to Austria as quickly as I can, but there were certain things I had to hit upon that I had to cover in Orly's life. And so in order to help build momentum and suspense, I mean, we all know what's coming. when we're reading that part of the book. So I picked, I did a lot of reading of, the timeline and picking out which particular events I thought might somehow resonate with each chapter. That would give us a sense of things closing in on them while they just kind of go about their lives. So in their going about their lives, there wasn't really a lot of momentum in that. But once I added the news, the bits of what was actually happening, the laws that were changing, the things that were making their life smaller and smaller, then it helped to build a little bit of tension in the beginning.
Yeah. Isn't it so interesting how sometimes adding something so small, like 2 to 3 sentences at the beginning of each chapter, can up the stakes in that way?
Yeah. I'm not even sure that was my idea, to be honest. I think it may have been my editor's idea, so I don't even necessarily want it.
Well, then clap to your editor. And another part of the book that really struck me was a conversation that Orly is having after she has moved to La Paz with her friend that she's met in the market, who is from Bolivia and like a native Bolivian. Am I pronouncing the name right? Naira?
I think it's Naira.
Naira. Okay.
Yeah, or at least that's how I say it in my head.
Okay, so Naira. And, they're just having a conversation, and Orly notices that whenever Naira is talking about the past, she gestures in front of her. And whenever she's talking about the future, she gestures behind her. And as an explanation for this, she says, the past is right in front of us where we can see it. It's the future we can't see. And that just struck me so hard because, in this pandemic right now, there are so many unknowns for us. And that was also at a part in the book where there were so many unknowns for Orly, how the war is going to end, if they're going to stay in La Paz, how her parents are going to be as people. And so it just made me curious about your relationship as a writer and just a person to the unknown, which is, I know, a big question.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm going to start with the writer part because my process, people are always asking novelists, do you outline first or do you just write? And the plotters versus the pantsers. And I tried a few times to outline, but once I've outlined something and I know where it's heading, I lose all interest in writing it. I have no interest in writing. Right? Yeah, it's dead. It's like, I know how it ends. What is the point of even sitting down? Like, it's like you're coloring in, I don't know, a coloring book or something. You're coloring within the lines. So for me, a lot of my investigation comes through the writing. And this is why I said it's so inefficient, because I write at least 5 times more material than I can use. Like, I'll just write my way into a character. And then once I feel I know who that character is, then I know which scenes I want to save that have her. With the book I'm working on now, I originally wrote 5 different beginnings for the book. And then, I ended up using all 5 of them in different parts of the book, but at least pieces.
Oh, good for you.
Well, it's not done yet. Things could happen. So I like the unknown. For me, I like not knowing what's going to happen when I sit down at my computer, because my writing process doesn't feel at all mechanical. It's very, I hate using the word organic, but there's something magical about it. I sit down and I start writing, and then exciting things happen. The hardest part about writing for me is getting to the chair. Like, once I'm in the chair, then, things start to happen. And so I'm very comfortable with not knowing what happens in my book, because my first draft, I always think of my first draft as generating clay, and then successive drafts as turning it into a sculpture, something slightly resembles a sculpture. So, and then in terms of the unknown in my own life, a lot of because we travel, we switch countries every 3 or 4 years, usually because of my husband's work, because he's a diplomat, but sometimes we get evacuated at short notice. This is not the first time we've been evacuated. So this has made us pretty flexible people in some ways. Certainly, we're all okay. The three of us, my husband, my daughter, and I, are all completely fine with landing in a country we know nothing about. We're completely fine with having no idea what our life is going to look like once we land. Because I was so busy before we lived in Uzbekistan, we lived in London, which is actually where I am at the moment. But and I didn't have time to do a lot of research about Uzbekistan. Tim did a lot of research, but I didn't have time to do it. And so, you know, when I landed there, I almost preferred that I hadn't done research, because I landed there and it was, oh, wow, look at this. It's all, you know, new and unexpected. And, you know, there's things that surprise you. So I like not knowing what's going to happen. If anyone offered to tell me what my future held, I would definitely not want to know. I would find that terrifying, to know the future. Like, you know, will you die of a strange virus? I don't want to know the answer to that right now. I just,
yeah. Yeah, that's great that you embrace the unknown so much. I feel like a lot of people could really use that, you know, flexibility in their lives, and, you know, the sort of just going with the flow.
I'm not sure that anyone would describe me as a going with the flow kind of person.
Oh.
I think my parents are listening, and they would not describe me that way. But in that way, yeah, we're very good travel. We go with the flow travel wise. I'm rigid in other ways, but that's not one of them.
Gotcha. Okay. And I don't want to spoil anything for readers, but the scene that you read for us is Orly's father sort of finding his connection to music again when they are in La Paz. And Orly's mother can't quite reconnect to music in the same way that Orly's father does. And I was just curious how you came up with this choice that, you know, the father can, but the mother can't, if there was anything behind that choice.
Eventually there was. There are reasons. Okay. So, I mean, it could have originally been either way, really. And I think part of it had to do with the fact that the father he was part of a much larger organization. So he was part of the Vienna Philharmonic. He was used to being part of something larger than himself. And he felt he kind of had to do that. He had to connect with other musicians, or he couldn't cope. Whereas I think singers, even if you're singing in an opera production, singers tend to be a little more solitary, and opera singers aren't always working with the same company over and over. They move around, they perform in different cities with different people. So perhaps aren't as quite as cohesive a group as a group of musicians who are basically all parts of the same body. And I think also for Orly's mother, I think we all process grief differently. And when I imagined her grief, it feels so, leaving her son behind in Europe. It's just, she's like, how could I sing when I've left my son behind? Like, singing somehow seems kind of, I don't know, to me, it seems like maybe it's a more organic expression. You don't require an instrument. It's just kind of
comes from yourself, not an instrument.
Right. There's no intermediary.
Yeah.
Whereas the viola is an intermediary. And maybe he could probably play sadness best if he was sad and happiness best if he was happy, but he could play anything, no matter what he was feeling. Whereas I think singing, I feel like, is a more emotional thing. But also so the mother ends up in a depression that ends up leading to some dramatic choices she makes later in the book. And because of what she does later, I needed her to be the one who struggles the most and who has the most depression. And she could only be the one that struggles the most if she's the one who loses music. Whereas Orly and her father, her father also, once he's in Bolivia, notices that, hey, there's music here. There's Bolivian music. There's sounds I've never heard before. There's instruments. And he kind of uses that as a way to connect to Bolivia. And Orly too, because she learns the charango. And it's just the mother who's like, I'm not singing, I'm not connecting, I'm not pretending that there's any continuity between my life in Vienna and my life here. There is no continuity. I don't have my son here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point about the singing. There's no intermediary, and that makes a lot of sense for why it might be harder to connect. Um, and this, you didn't flag this when I emailed this question to you, so I hope it's not like a giveaway thing. I won't say anything about which character, but there is a character once they're in La Paz, and after the war has ended, as we know, some of the Nazis start coming to these countries where the Jewish people have taken refuge, and the Nazis are sort of fleeing their persecution by coming to these places. And there's a character who decides to take revenge against these Nazis and to kill them in a sort of a sort of secretive way. And Orly's father and Orly are very against this. And meanwhile, me as the reader, I was like, hell yeah, kill those Nazis. So I was just curious what you as the writer were sort of thinking as you were writing these scenes, if your sympathy lied with, this character who was doing these things, or maybe if, you sort of agreed with Orly and her father that it was not okay.
Well, it's good that you can't tell from, how I feel from the book. So, I mean, I included that because my friend John, who I mentioned earlier, he told me about running into Klaus Barbie on the streets of La Paz. And I thought, what must that have been like to think you finally found a safe haven and then to run into, perpetrators of genocide, on your way to the market. So, so I wanted that to be a part of the book. And I think, when I think about it, and I think a lot of times my characters have arguments with each other that are arguments I have with myself. So I think there's a scene with two people arguing about whether or not it's right to kill these Nazis, right? And one of them is giving all the obvious reasons for killing Nazis, and the other one's saying, but by turning yourself into a killer, how are you not making yourself more like them? Not that it's the same. It's not the same as what the Nazis did. It's a response to what the Nazis did, but all the same, it is committing murder. And I think, I feel kind of both ways, and I don't know how I would behave in that situation, because I don't think any of us know how we would behave, during like all the crazy things that happened before and during, after the war. There were lots of really difficult decisions people had to make. And I don't think any of us know what decision we would have made in certain circumstances unless we were there and forced to make it. Because it's easy to say, oh, I would have definitely done the right thing. I would have taken the moral high ground, or I would have risked my own life. But would you? And would you have risked your own life if you had a small daughter? And how would that change? There's all these things. And so I've come to no conclusions about what I would do if I, knew that I was going to run into Klaus Barbie.
Yeah, that's probably why those scenes were so powerful, because you couldn't feel any, sort of judgment or decision coming from the author at all. And so it allows, the reader to just sort of take in the opinions of the characters.
Well, that's good. I mean, I feel like they both have legitimate points of view, I feel like. So, I want them each to support their best argument.
Yes. Yeah. And then this is a question that I always want to ask other writers, because I feel like it's not really talked about a lot. How did you learn how to write a novel? And, did anyone teach you, or did you have to sort of figure it out on your own? Because I remember when I was younger having this thought that at some point someone was going to teach me how to write a novel. And I thought maybe in my MFA program that would happen, and then it didn't. And then, afterwards, it's like you're kind of on your own. So did you use any sort of guidebooks, or how did you teach yourself to write a novel?
I mean, that's a good question. That's another one that, I've had to think about. no one taught me how to write a novel, in that, you know, when I did my MFA program, I thought I was a short story writer, but it turns out that, you know, being succinct is not my strong suit. I struggle to write anything under 400 pages. So, but I, you know, wasted my MFA trying to write short stories and never attempted a novel. But there certainly was no instruction on how to write a novel or how to begin to write a novel. And of course, there's a million different ways to write a novel. So I think I do teach novel writing, but I find it quite difficult because everyone's process is so different. So I'm in a PhD program right now, and when I had my first meeting with my supervisor, I was really nervous because I thought, oh my God, what if he's going to make me outline stuff? You know, because I can't do that and it will just kill everything. And the first thing he said was, you don't outline things, do you? Because like, that's not how I work. And anyway, so we were like, oh, we work the same way. This is great. And it all, you know, it's all glorious. But I also, so no one taught me, but I mean, there was a lot of trial and error. I do have a couple of unsuccessful novels in metaphorical drawers. But I guess I learned the most about how to write a novel from reading. You know, reading like a writer, noticing what the author is doing. I mean, sometimes it's hard because you get really caught up in a story and you just want to find out what happens and what happens to the characters, and you forget to read for structure and what they're doing. But I do really, I read for that. So when I wrote my first book, which was a memoir, I only read other memoirs. And so when I started writing a novel, I would try to read other novels to kind of see how they experimented with time. Like The Ambassador's Wife goes back and forth in time. And I wanted to make sure that, you know, that was okay. I think at the beginning, you're kind of looking for permission to do things. And it's later in your career where you're like, I'm going to be groundbreaking and do something that's never done before. But I don't think I've done that yet. So I'm not there.
Do you remember if there were any specific books that you read while you were preparing this book that sort of gave you a window into how you might handle something?
There were so many. I mean, a lot of what I read as research for this were memoirs, not just published memoirs, but some of them were memoirs that were written just for people's families so that they wouldn't, that their families would know what they went through. Like John's mother, who was in Poland, she lost her 2-year-old daughter and her parents. They were massacred in a death camp. And she provided testimony that's now in a museum in Israel, a Holocaust museum in Israel. And that testimony John gave me, and so I read that. Sorry to get off topic.
Oh, no, it's great.
But in terms of what I was reading, it was a lot of these personal accounts. And what I remember most are the ways people describe their experiences in Bolivia. There was a journal written by a miner. It was called something like My 6 Years in Bolivia. And he wrote it, I think, just for his family, but it was so detailed and, you know, provided things like what foods they ate and the fact that canned goods were luxuries and you couldn't buy clothing. You had to buy cloth and get patterns and have it made and all those things. I had never written a historical novel before this. And every time I started to write a scene, there was something I didn't know. You know, when the mother is cooking a lot, and I thought, what is she cooking on? I don't even know what the stove would have looked like. And I had to learn that there were kerosene burners and that you had to pump it up to turn the liquid into gas and light it. And then I found myself sitting around watching YouTube videos on how to light a kerosene.
I do that all the time when I write. I could not write without YouTube videos.
I know. I was like, I can't believe I'm watching kerosene burners like in my afternoon. But anyway, so, I mean, I can't think of a novel offhand that particularly informed this. It was more personal accounts, maybe because I wanted this to feel like a real personal account.
And, you know, I imagine that reading those memoirs also helped you with structure and everything, because it sort of gives you a natural plot progression, you know, of all the things that happen to these people that you can then think of using in your own work. So I imagine it helped with a lot of structural and character-based things also.
Yeah, just two novels did just pop into my head. One is The Hare
Mm.
with the Amber Eyes, and one is, it's got waltz in the title. Last Waltz in, no, is it Last Waltz in Vienna?
That sounds right.
Someone will know.
Yeah.
But yeah, those two books were just wonderful, brilliant books. And they were stories of their families. So they were memoirs, but they read like a novel.
Mm.
Whereas I guess I hoped I was writing a novel that kind of read like a memoir.
Yes, yes, that's a good description for it because it felt so real. All those details you mentioned, like the kerosene stove and what people would have been eating, all those details really contributed to making it feel so real.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, yeah.
That was I was so nervous that someone would say, "Ooh, no, they wouldn't have eaten that food," or whatever. But
Right. Well, maybe someone today will tell you.
yeah, maybe. Always a possibility. Oh, speaking of which, are we?
Yeah, I think it might be time for questions. I have some more that I can ask you, but maybe we'll let someone tell us if it's time for questions.
Hi.
Hi, it's a bit of time for questions. We can circle back to some more of a discussion between you and Celia in a second, but we do have some questions from Facebook and on Zoom.
Oh,
so
great.
The first one is, how did you research Bolivian Indigenous people?
Good question. I basically, I had friends who were Aymara when I lived there, and we also knew people who were Quechua, and so I spent time with them over 4 years, quite a lot of time with our Aymara friends, and who actually read a draft of this book. So it was really important to me that I have them read a draft of this book. So I made sure I didn't get anything glaringly wrong when I was talking about Aymara culture and festivals and things like that. So I also read a lot of research, anthropological research, and that has been done, academic research that's been done about the indigenous communities of Bolivia. Some kind of post-colonial stuff too. So it was a real kind of mix of things. I read books of Aymara myths and legends. So, because there's a fair number of myths and legends in the book. And so those come from reading Aymara myths and legends. So.
And then, so Facebook seems to be particularly interested in your research process. So the second question is also a research one.
Okay.
And it's from Fran, who asks, in your research, did you discover any books you fell in love with?
I met a lot of people I fell in love with. And what was really interesting to me is that the refugee accounts that I read of people who had lived in Bolivia during this time disagreed with each other about a lot of things. And I found that really interesting, and just kind of a reminder that this is not a homogenous group of people. They were from different backgrounds, and they just happened to all be refugees here. But when I asked this, one of my most significant interviews was with a man who left Vienna when he was 8 years old to come to La Paz, and he's still alive. He's 88 right now. And he basically considers himself Bolivian. He would never, ever go back to Austria. He cannot forgive them. He still cried when I interviewed him. And oh yes. And so I asked him, I said, did you experience anti-Semitism in La Paz, in Bolivia? And he said, never, ever, never experienced anti-Semitism, ever. And he was really, he was adamant that it had never happened. Whereas I talked to other people who said, yes, there was anti-Semitism, and then I dug up some anti-Semitic cartoons that were in newspapers of the time, one of which I talk about in the book. So clearly there was, but not everyone experienced it, and people had different ideas about how anti-Semitic people were or not. and how welcoming people were or not. And I had people who said the refugee community and the Bolivians never mixed. They never mixed at all. They never intermarried. But I interviewed at least 3 people who married Bolivians. So there's just different points of view, and that was fascinating. So I kind of fell in love with all these different stories and people, and the kind of horrific things they all endured. I mean, one woman, her husband died, and then she had to end up in Venezuela, and then all these horrible things. I mean, just kind of tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. You lose your home and your family, and then you go to Bolivia, and then you lose your child, or you get sick, or your husband dies of a strange disease. Or sorry, rambling a little, but
No, that's fascinating. And then another question from Facebook is, in your research, did you discover any book? Oh, sorry. Was there anything in your research that shocked you or surprised you that you didn't expect to find out?
There were probably a lot of things. There were some fun things, like I interviewed Leo Spitzer, who wrote Hotel Bolivia, which is a memoir. He was born in Bolivia and lived there till he was 10. And he said when he was little, he would collect these little bits of film that were called pelis, short for película, and you collected them from your favorite films, and you could hold them up to the light, and you'd see like a frame from Rebecca, or a Western, or a Mexican film, or whatever. And the kids collected them, and they would play games with them where you stuck them in a book, and whoever got their bit of film in the same page as another person's bit of film, I can't remember who won, but I loved hearing about that. Like, it was a game that I never would have thought of. It never occurred to me to collect little bits of movie film. And I thought, that's just such a fabulous detail. I have to include that. So of course, Miguel became a collector. Miguel is Orly's first friend, and he collects these pelis. And that for me was a really interesting little thing to note. There were, let's see, what shocked me. I mean, some of the things were familiar to me because I lived in La Paz for 4 years. Like, the altitude was familiar to me. I'd lived at altitude. I knew what that felt like. For me, it's different for everyone. I think, I know something that was interesting and surprising is, so I was looking, because Orly is largely drawn to girls and women romantically, for the most part, but not exclusively. And so when I was researching this, I read a lot about lesbian and gay life in Austria and Germany during the war, before the war and during the war. And that was really fun. I really enjoyed reading about that. And it was, mostly underground, but I was really I was amazed when I read the book, The Scorpion. And it's a lesbian novel. And there's three, it's like a series of 3 books. But it's a lesbian novel, and it's about this woman who basically has to run away from her family because she keeps falling passionately in love with women. And she finally escapes her family and finds this lesbian community in Berlin. And just the kind of wild parties and sex and these relationships that were all going on that weren't necessarily all that hidden. I mean, that was really interesting. I think that a lot of people, when we think about the past, we think, oh, the past was more uptight and they didn't have as much sex and they didn't do things like that. But people clearly have always been having sex, or we wouldn't be here. And lots of it, and with all kinds of people. So I enjoyed learning about that world.
Oh, right. And then our next question from Facebook is actually for Celia. And we had Ellen ask, what is Under the Rainbow about?
Oh,
yeah, Under the Rainbow is about a small town in Kansas. It's a fictional town called Big Burr, that's named the most homophobic town in the nation by a nonprofit. And then they send in a task force of queer people and allies to try and help this town become not the most homophobic town in the nation. And we called it a novel, but it's kind of like linked stories. Each story is written from the perspective of a different character. So some are task force members and some are townspeople. And, you know, they all sort of come together in different ways throughout the course of the book.
Can I just make one comment, which is that Celia does this incredible job of making every character completely believable. I mean, down to the tiniest details. Like, I was shocked that when I discovered she wasn't a gay man, because like she writes really well from the point of view of a gay man, and from, you know, the point of view of a straight man whose wife leaves him for a lesbian. I mean, it's just like was amazing to me that she could write from all these different points of view. I mean, it takes a lot of empathy and attention to detail and, you know, creative imagination to do that. And I just love this book so much.
Oh,
so
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, that raises a question for both of you, which I'm just going to ask as I'm curious, is how do you sort of keep yourself from being poured into your characters as you're writing?
Do you want to go first, Jennifer?
I mean, you're welcome to go first. They've been listening to me a lot.
Yeah, I would say that there are certain characters that are more, you know, tempting to really put yourself into, and there are other characters where it's very easy to disconnect. And I find that I don't know if I'm a different sort of writer than a lot of other writers, but so many writers talk about when they're writing that they really feel that they are like in this zone that is almost religious. You know, so many writers talk about their writing being like a transporting religious experience, but I feel that I'm still pretty like aware of my own separate reality while I'm writing. And so I don't have that feeling necessarily of forgetting that I am creating fictional worlds. So yeah, I find that it's generally pretty easy to create that separation between me and the characters, although my second book is a novel where I identify a little bit more with the main character, and this is a character that carries through the whole novel as opposed to linked stories. And I do think that I probably have a little bit of a harder time extricating myself from that character as opposed to the ones in Under the Rainbow.
Yeah, I mean, I like Celia. I do not have a mystical experience when I write, and I don't get into like I never forget to eat. Like it just doesn't happen. And you know, people are like, oh, and I forgot about meal times, and I was just there for 9 hours. I'm like, okay, I can't. I get up to make tea like every 20 minutes. So it's kind of more of like short, intense things for me than a like religious experience thing. I also have a child, so. But I feel like for me, with each successive book, I've moved farther and farther away from anything like me. And I hope that continues to happen because I've lived with me a long time and I don't really need to do that anymore. And I kind of got that out of the way in the memoir and everything. So now, you know, in this book there's no Americans in it, let alone someone like me. So, I mean, I couldn't, I mean, I had to, I mean, clearly I'm the writer, I'm using parts of me, but you know, all my previous characters were vegetarians and and this, you know, she wasn't because she wouldn't have been probably, although a lot of people in Austria apparently were going through a vegetarian phase, but anyway, so yeah, there's, you know, Austrians and Bolivians, but no Americans in this book. And that didn't even occur to me until I was finished writing it. I thought, there were no Americans in that book. So in fact, there were no English speakers, which is a weird thought. But I guess All the Light We Cannot See is also, there's no English speakers and it's written by an American. So.
And then we have time for just one final question, and this one is from the Zoom chat, which asks, what do you do to help with the secondary trauma when doing this research and creating characters who have survived this trauma?
Okay. not all my characters survive their trauma. I'm not going to give anything away, but most of anyway, not all my characters survive the trauma. Let's leave it at that. I mean, I think, there were so many different ways people coped with having survived the horrors of the Holocaust. And, so many people who committed suicide because they simply couldn't live with the memory. And that I completely understand. Because sometimes knowing what we're capable of, actually, this is a conversation Orly has with someone towards the end of the book. Her friend says, knowing this, like, how do we go on? How do we go on? And I think we each have our own answer to that question. And not all of us go on, which is clear. Some people just don't. And some people can recover. Some people maybe not recover. I don't think you ever recover from the death of a child, but people have different ways of moving forward in their lives, not necessarily away from that pain, because it never goes away, I imagine. But with my family, I think music is a big part of it, for the characters. And there's other things they lean on, friends. For Orly, she wants to be connected to as many people as possible. She needs connection. She wants grounding. She's kind of searching for something more solid under her feet. And so people are important to her, as it's not just music for her. And also it becomes about poetry, because poetry she uses as a way to connect her past to her present. So there's a lot of kind of art here. Theater too is actually this one scene where Orly is in a play with someone else. And this other person, this friend of hers, is not a natural actress and is really doing a bad job at being Isis in Iphis and Ianthe, right? So Orly says to her, just like, you have to just be this goddess. Like, don't you understand? This is your chance not to be someone who's been orphaned by this horrible experience, because this person's parents had been killed. She's like, this is your chance, like, not to be that. You don't have to be like the survivor of horrors. You could just be Isis. And like, after the play, sorry, I still get like goosebumps even like talking about that, because theater is my background. So I think about it a lot. But after the play, the character comes to Orly and says, like, I don't ever want to be Rachel again. Like, this was transporting for me. I really was someone who was not me, and it was so freeing not to be me. If that makes any sense. Sorry, I it's hard to feel remotely positive about the world, but I mean, some people do have, are more resilient than others, and more, more believing that there's a reason to all this madness than.
Yes, no, it's true. Amen. So thank you both for a wonderful discussion. To the attendees, if you haven't purchased your copy of Exile music yet, you can do so at strandbooks.com. We also have Celia's Under the Rainbow too, so feel free to purchase that as well. And then any final remarks, Jennifer?
I just want to thank you all for being here. I know there's about 10 trillion virtual events around these days, not to mention all the movies you could be watching, or the, dance class you could be taking online, or whatever. And so I'm just grateful that you chose to be here for an hour with us. It's lonely here, as I'm sure it is where you are too. So thank you for connecting in this small way. And thank you very much for hosting me. I love this Strand. So everyone buy your books from this Strand. Save the Strand, save New York City's economy, save Celia and me from poverty. Anyway, but thank you. Just thank you for being here. And thank you, Celia, for agreeing to do this with me.
Oh, of course, it was a delight. As I said, it was like so wonderful to read your book these past few days and just get away.
Likewise. Even Big Burr was like such a great place to be.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great night. We'll see you at our next event.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.